Welcome to the City Futures Research Center seminar series. I'd like to acknowledge that today we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Pijigo people of the Eora Nation and would like to pay my respect to the elders past and present, as well as any First Nations people joining us today. If you're joining online, please mute your cameras and turn off your microphones during the presentations. Once we get to Q&A, you're welcome to turn your cameras back on and unmute yourself. Also, if you can put your questions in the question box and we will be monitoring the chat for any questions. Now I'd like to hand it over to Georgia, who will introduce today's speaker.
Our speaker today is Susan Ruinaard, a research officer here at City Futures, where she works on data-driven housing research. Susan holds a master's degree in engineering and policy analysis from Delft University of Technology. Her thesis, which she'll be presenting today, focuses on achieving socio-spatial justice in urban heating transitions. Susan's research interests lie in the processes that shape our cities, regions, and communities, which she explores through spatial data analysis. Please join me in welcoming Susan Ruinaard.
Very happy to be presenting here today. I'm really excited to bring my thesis to you all. Although it's in a Dutch context, I hope that we can draw some general lessons also for cities worldwide and how we can focus transitions, urban transitions, any type of transition around communities and shifting away from individual approaches. The case study city I used is The Hague, the city I was living in back in the Netherlands and will return to soon. It's a city that's really diverse. It has 570,000 inhabitants and our political capital. That also brings a quite diverse population with them, with people working at embassies with multinational backgrounds. We have an historical divide between Hagenese and Hagenaren. There are students living there, but we also have disadvantaged areas that are living quite segregated from parts that we will also see within the presentation. I did my thesis under supervision of a really great and diverse team, which are presented in the pictures at the bottom across TU Delft, across my faculty of technology, policy and management, but also of the built environment. And I did my thesis during an internship at Generation Energy, which is an urban planning office working on energy transitions across spatial skills. Today, I'm going to talk you through generally the Dutch urban heating transition to give you some context on the analysis that you'll see and the justice framework I've used. This justice framework consists of 3 dimensions, consisting of the who, what, and how. That structures the middle part of the presentation, and then I will finish with if we know this, so what? The who dimension consists of recognizing vulnerabilities, so bringing diversity in looking at transitions. The what I conceptualized by analyzing disparities in lived experiences, but also in access to technologies. The how will center around policy rationales that we can test and see how well they cover social justice besides transition goals, which we will evaluate. And the so what will center around from individual action to collective transitions. So decarbonizing the residential built environment is much needed in face of climate change. In the Netherlands, about 22% of gas usage is used for housing for residential use, of which 75% for home heating. So It's quite a challenge to get these all disconnected from the gas network, which they aim to disconnect 7 million homes by 2050, with a target of 1.5 million by 2030, and also insulate homes, 2.5 million by 2030, primarily focusing on poorly insulated dwellings. On the map, you see the areas that have the highest gas consumption per dwelling. And this area aligns with the older and the larger and the detached buildings that we see in The Hague, with the other areas being more apartment buildings from later years. Although 2030 feels like it's already around the corner, the heating transition is still progressing quite slowly. In 2019, we still had 90% of our dwellings connected to the gas network, 92%, and in 2030, we were at 90%. So we only disconnected 2% of our dwellings in a time span of 4 years. We do see the gas usage per dwelling declining, but that's mainly because we had more mild weather. So we needed to heat up less, and also because the cost of energy have been rising steeply, people try to use less energy for heating. Generally, the urban heating transition is seen as very complex, hence that's why it's moving forward so slowly. There are plenty of social barriers we see due to variety of ownership structures between homeowners, private renters, and social housing and involved within the heating transition, but also a different that people might be willing to transition or not, and often they don't really feel the urgency because everybody has in their head that we will have gas until 2050, while in reality we cannot transition everybody in 2050 only. We need to do it more early, but there is no direct need for many people yet. Also, there are many technological barriers. Of course, it's a challenge in itself to create a new infrastructure in a city that is used daily, that is layered, that has all those historical buildings we see a lot in The Hague, and that the technology itself might not be available where you need it. As with the heating transition, we might use heating sources from greenhouse gases that are far outside of the city. And also the legislation is lagging behind. There is still loads of uncertainty about who is going to pay for the development of the infrastructure, who is going to own the infrastructures, and what will the price of heating be. So there is a lot of uncertainty still. And generally, the investments for installation and adaptation of the clean heating technology are very, very high. Per dwelling, we are speaking from numbers of 10,000 euros or maybe much upwards. Might be triple even if you look at different technologies. So a high financial aspect that makes it harder to quickly transition to. I don't know what my slides are doing. But with many transitions, there is a risk that people are left behind in transition because they cannot access making the measures that are provided to make a change. And we have seen in all those transitions and how cities are developing that there are growing inequalities between social groups and also between neighborhoods. And if you rely on individual policies, you risk leaving them out, making those inequalities larger. Therefore, equitable policies must encompass, besides the usual technological and economic indicators, also social objectives to make sure that we distribute opportunities fairly and effectively. About inequality generally, specifically within the energy domain, is that we also have seen rising energy poverty. If the government would not have energy relief schemes, in 2019, a study classified 7% of households in the Netherlands as energy poor, and that would have risen to 10% or even 11% in 2023 if they did get financial compensation. But that number, we suppose, might be higher as people in financial distress might not have used energy that they needed to live their daily lives fully. And that's another form of energy poverty. So it doesn't always have to be how much money you need to pay for energy itself. It's also having enough energy to live your life. The research aim I was working with was to explore the benefits of community-oriented urban heating transitions. And also, if you know where those benefits are, how can you realize that potential? How can you realize that people who get the opportunity to transition their house can also do that? And how can local government support such just transition outcomes? Therefore, I used a mix of 3 theories of justice, which might seem a little bit much, but I started with the energy justice framework, and that's a framework for analyzing equity and fairness regarding the energy system and related policies. But you can, of course, further conceptualize such a framework, and that's how I integrated the inclusion of geographic space into the framework to see not only differences between social groups, but also through between neighborhoods. And I use the capability approach to understand what people are actually able to do and to be with transition measures. And this basically gives the this basically results in an analysis where people must be recognized as different with diverse needs. That policies must enable agency and not just distribute technologies. And that justice is not just about the equality of resource access, but also equity in lived outcomes. So the energy justice framework has typically 3 dimensions that also correspond to the way I structured this presentation. Recognition justice, that relates to the who. I will just use this. No, distributed justice that relates to what. So those multidimensional social spatial disparities, and then the how in the procedural justice. To identify which policies and resources you need to reach equity. So start with recognition justice. You can think of many factors, but you can cluster them into 3 groups, into personal, environmental, and societal factors, and they describe how well people can access opportunities within the transition. The personal factors relate to individual level enablers or barriers for accessing the resources. So you can think of language, if it's Dutch their first language or not, if they need to work with a policy. And also financial capacity. Environmental factors emerge from the built environment where people live in. So that can be that you live in a monumental building, and that you have more regulations to go through before you make a change to your house. But it's also the availability of a heating technology. Like, can you still get district heating? You cannot get district heating if there is no network close by and there are no plans to develop that close to you. And the societal factors relate to policies, social norms, and power dynamics. And you can classify subsidy incentives under that, but also the acceptance of change around you. If people are all a little bit distrusting about those technologies, it's unlikely that you have the societal freedom to choose for yourself. From my data set that I downloaded from the census, I identified 17 environmental and personal factors influencing this local vulnerability in the heating transition. With on the environmental side, monuments, shared buildings, energy inefficient properties, high energy usage, and also a mix of functions. So if there are shops in your building too, or that is just primarily residential. On the personal side, I identified certain age groups that are less likely to be able to transition, people with a migration background, given the language barriers and the knowledge of the local context. Also the household structure, if you are a two-earner or not, or if you have children or not. Some income-based factors, and also the home ownership structure influencing whether you can make changes yourself or not. The societal factors will come back more in the policy evaluation side story at the end. I mapped quickly to show how diverse local vulnerabilities can be. I mapped all the different factors for you, and you can see that some factors often go together, such as really bad energy labels with high gas usage, as that's the older side of the A with more monumental buildings too. And you see that many people with an European migration background live there too, single people, but on the inverse, you also see that where we have immediate or average energy labels, where you still need to have some insulation, that it goes together with people with non-European migration backgrounds and low income, also living quite separated from each other. I not only focused on which factors I wanted to use, I also focused on the spatial scale I wanted to run my analysis on. Often when we look at data, that is pre-aggregated for us on a suburb level or a neighborhood level, but those boundaries are a result of political processes or historical processes, and it often does not reflect the diversity within the neighborhood itself. So I started with a street level data set and used an algorithm to make groups within those streets that shared similarities, which enabled us to go beyond administrative boundaries and issues with them to surface hidden challenges, because they otherwise could be averaged away in neighborhood boundary. And then we aggregated the indicators from the previous slide into one index, showing where people might have experienced more barriers to access opportunities in the heating transition. I will only quickly discuss the societal factors in relation to what we see in the higher vulnerability areas, because those local communities, they are more likely to experience an accumulation of inequalities in their lived experiences. So higher energy poverty, lower general health outcomes, lower livability, and also less socioeconomic status. So they have other things to worry about probably than the heating transition. And they also have low access to individual energy measures, such as rooftop solar and heat pumps. Often they live in apartment buildings. They don't have a roof for themselves. Their apartments are not as big, but also they might not have the financial resources or the home ownership, it's lots of social housing too, to make those changes themselves. But there is an opportunity in the rollout of district heating. This is largely due to the efforts by social housing associations and municipal policy. But what we see is that it's still inaccessible for people not living in social housing. It's inaccessible to private renters and homeowners. And also when the social housing association wants to develop a district heating connection for their housing, there's a risk of opt-out if residents don't want it, they don't want to change. There are many things to say why you should want it, but also why people don't want it yet, maybe. So people might opt out if they don't. So resulting in inaccessibility. So how can we make sure that the resources that we allocate to speed up the heating transition actually reach the people who might need it the most? Generally, if we think of policies such as a subsidy, they translate spatially in differentiating access to technologies. And you see this really well with subsidies for rooftop solar. If you want to have solar panels for yourself and you make use of the subsidy, you need to, of course, know the language. You need to know how subsidies work, maybe to some extent, but maybe you need to be a homeowner and you need to have a roof, which is only available in the more affluent parts of the Hague. So therefore, to see if you're not going to rely on subsidies this time, but look at policies from a different rationale, what can that do by shifting the focus from the individual approaches to community-based approaches? So we therefore identified 5 policies and transferred them intentionally into catchment areas based on underlying data to see if you would take this as your policy rationale, who would you reach? And you see really distinct patterns. Well, subsidies and willingness, they are quite similar. It's logical. People already use the subsidy. They are willing to transition as well. Housing associations, they house the most vulnerable groups in the Netherlands, and they follow quite similar pattern too. And vision of the Hague, they have a vision for 2050, which neighborhood to transition. So we want to evaluate that one too. But to evaluate those policies, we assume that the municipality has supported really successful community building and enabled communities, everyone living there, to transition. What are the trade-offs in those policy rationales? By assessing the trade-off in between 3 indicators: the affordability that the policy has covered, the decarbonization that the policy has covered, and the total investment needed for that. That's the maps I showed earlier in this presentation. And you see that decarbonization and investments, they are really similar, and that's logical because older, larger, detached buildings, they need just more investments per dwelling than anywhere else. And the pattern is also inverted from affordability as those who are living in smaller apartments, often in social housing in these areas. If we would see how these indicators add up for the individual approaches, we see that about 50 to 60% of decarbonization and investments is done, but that they only covered about 1/3 of all affordability we have in The Hague. And that's really stark contrast with community-based approaches where almost similar amounts of decarbonization and investment are covered between the 40 and the 50%. Maybe it's even for the amount of people that you are able to transition, who cannot transition by themselves. It's really cost effective, while you're also covering twice as much vulnerability. So the resources that you invest by taking such approaches, they are way better to reach communities that need it. And to layer this besides the existing municipal policy is that they are doing a great job with at least choosing the areas that they want to transition on the short term. And this is mainly due because the heating solutions and the densities are more on the outside of the city. And you need those densities to implement district heating and to make good use of the infrastructure that you want to build. So the rationale for that was not so much covering social vulnerability. They do acknowledge their partnerships with social housing associations, but it was more convenient, I think, that those objectives aligned than anything else. It is a quite top-down way of planning such a transition, of course. And in The Hague's transition vision, they describe themselves as taking a directing or governing role and making sure that the process is rolling and that the partners are meeting and that they organize participation also with citizens, business owners, and other stakeholders, and not at a city scale, but in different neighborhoods, and that they would like to support existing energy cooperatives. But if you would rethink the role of the municipality, is that it's still unclear how they would handle diversity, existing barriers for those local communities, and whether everyone can access the participation process. There's still a risk of opt-out, there's still a risk that not all voices are heard. And they mention also that they would support existing energy cooperatives while they are only in the more affluent areas of The Hague, but they acknowledge the benefits that you have of shared ownership and such initiatives. So just that it would be great to see a municipality in a leading role to provide not only a technical infrastructure, but also a social one. This brings me back to a slide we have seen previously. To overcome the inaccessibility to private renters, homeowners, and the risk of opt-out is to acknowledge the environmental and personal barriers, work with low willingness, bring it up, and initiate local energy cooperatives, which would result in collective financial means. You would employ existing social networks and tailor your engagement strategies to the needs of the communities. If you would like to tailor to local needs with the model that we created, we made scorecards describing each community that we have in the model, where you see here that we have a large share of children living in this area, but also a lot of single parents, people who will receive state benefits with lower property valuation and about an average energy label. So it would be great that strategies that are used to transition this local community, that it would cover and overcome the barriers together with the municipality. To not If we want to achieve this, and the role of the municipalities should change. They cannot only take a directing or governing role maybe anymore, but they can be brokers of citizen engagement. They can support collective action, moving from subsidies to social infrastructures. They can proactively consider complexities in urban spaces and embrace this diversity in better lived experiences for all. And move from fixing people's lives like everybody needs a new heating system to embracing taking care of people and that they can take action themselves. And that brings me to my last slide, the so what. That's if we want to have more equitable outcomes, that we should move from individualism to community-based solutions, because now we are almost surprised when inequalities are growing, as we do not acknowledge that people's capacity to access technologies or change is equal. And therefore we need to move from individual burdens to collective capabilities, acknowledging that transitions require spatial sensitivity, social engagement, and systems thinking, and that cities cannot only lead technically or on the process, but also lead socially and politically. And that concludes my presentation. Do you have any questions?
Is there, have you any idea, are other European jurisdictions doing similar things, or?
I don't know, our heating transition or our energy transition looks really different than our neighboring countries, because we found gas about 80 years ago, I suppose, and that's why we all transitions our dwellings to gas like really long ago, and now we need to let go of gas, while other countries, they might have been more reliant on coal, and they can transition to gas because they will still produce compared to the goals we have.
Have you been using Russian gas?
I think we used to import loads of Russian gas, but we stopped doing that, of course, with all the political tensions. And you also saw that gas prices were rising, but also the urgency to take this transition more seriously also emerged. So yeah, there is a big gap in it would have been nice if this transition went quicker than it actually does, because we don't want to rely on imports anymore, because you never know what happens. Thanks. Yeah.
I have a question about your slides 18 and 19. You compared two approaches of business as usual and community approach. And I was looking at the maps on the bottom.
Yeah.
And when the community approach comes, the geography of the colors that you showed on your map changes from like rural areas into inner cities.
Yeah. It's actually all the city. So this is all quite built in the same densities. So you have, we go to this one.
Mhm.
I think this square in the middle and here are all, like here you have lower residential densities and more affluent areas. And in the inner city, you indeed have higher density or more apartment buildings with a more diverse population. And these areas to the bottom, they are really new neighborhoods. So that's why the geography changed so much. And the social vulnerability is almost inverted from the gas usage and the investment needed for that, because more vulnerable people, they are less likely to live in a big, old, pretty beautiful Dutch house, of course, which are more present there. So they are needs quite, there's a stark contrast between them. Does that answer your question?
I was wondering that you're like examining the effectiveness of these two approaches.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
so the community-oriented approaches were more effective in the inner more dense
Yeah.
areas, right?
That's mainly because it's different policy rationales. I made them. I used data, for instance, on housing association, and I just told my data set, give me the 50% of areas that have the most social housing. And the social housing just happens to be in the inner city more in the southwest of The Hague. And that's why if you would take that policy rationale, you would reach those areas because of the social housing there.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense now, because I was wondering, well, why is it just being more effective in inner cities?
Yeah.
That's why, yeah, thank you.
You said the government's goals are behind, they're going slowly. I think you said
Yeah.
19%. What's the projected date for arriving there at the moment?
Oh, I think it's out of the window, but they won't ever say that. But we have now a government that likes postponing things that are really, going for sustainability. And I think many of the urban heating transition projects we had, they were sort of living labs with social housing as an entity that has many properties that you can transition as one because there's one owner. It was sort of living labs, but now they're experimenting in areas where people are homeowners or more private renters, and that every one of the neighborhoods has a say. Of course, everybody in social housing has a say too, but that you need to deal with more diverse needs. And they are now experiencing that it's not going as planned, and people are way less willing than people expected beforehand. So I think they thought it would accelerate, but now with all those new lessons, with the diverse needs of people, it's definitely going to slow down the transition even further. The first lead.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm wondering about like which agencies are the targets of this sort of presentation of data and who's persuaded or
Yeah.
vindicated by these things.
I think that's really distinct from the context here, but we really have a government-led urban planning. So if they are changing things within the city, there is a quite large involvement of what government wants, and they will hire consultants to show them, or they can probably also do it themselves, but often they ask for external knowledge as well to map these kind of things. I think the primary problem with not getting those analyses easily to municipalities is that they are, of course, already asking questions that they want to have answered if they are searching for knowledge, and that it's very unlikely to incorporate this if they do not ask the question. So I'm hoping that I can present maybe once at a conference where municipalities are as well. But it's really the change and the vision of the municipality if they want to have social objectives into their transitions, but they start doing it. We also have environmental planning agencies, and that gives advice to the government, and they are alarming on growing inequalities in space. So on the national level, things are happening, and it's definitely changes the way municipalities ask questions too. So let's hope.
Good. Thanks so much, Susan, and thanks everyone for joining today. Just a reminder that our next seminar will be held in 2 weeks on 15th of May. And we'll hear from two of our postgrad students, Ella Gorgovska and Josh Hernandez. Ella will present her research titled The Value of the City Square, the Formation and Civic Identity of Urban Public Space in Identifying Sydney. And Josh will share his project on Ford's soundscape design in the built environment, exploring research practice gaps in New South Wales with implementation science. We look forward to see you then, and thanks for your time. I hope you have a great afternoon.